When We Disagree is a show about arguments, how we have them, why we have them, and their impact on our relationships and ourselves. Let's bet on a coin flip. Heads, you win $150. Tails, you lose $100. Rationally, you should take this bet. It's even odds and you stand to win more than you stand to lose. But most people refuse. Their reluctance stems from loss aversion, the psychological principle that losses hurt roughly twice as much as equivalent gains feel good. This quirk of human psychology explains why many arguments become so intractable. Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky discovered that people will fight harder to avoid losing something more than they will to gain something of equal value. This isn't just about money. It applies to relationships, status, beliefs, even parking spaces. Once we possess something, we overvalue it simply because it's ours. Consider how loss aversion inflames everyday disputes. Divorce negotiations turn vicious, not over acquiring assets, but over not losing them. Neighbors feud for decades over inches of a property line. Employees resist new systems not because the old way is better, but because change means losing familiar routines. That friend who won't throw away broken appliances, they're not just hoarding, they're experiencing the pain of loss. And in relationships, loss aversion creates peculiar dynamics. We stay in unsatisfying situations because ending them feels like losing, even when staying in them means missing better opportunities. During arguments, conceding a point feels like losing ground, so we defend positions we don't even care about. The fear of losing face becomes even more powerful than the desire to resolve conflicts. Organizations struggle with loss aversion constantly. Companies cling to failing strategies because abandoning them means acknowledging losses. Employees won't share knowledge because they fear losing their unique value. And teams resist restructuring even when current structures aren't working at all. Even the endowment effect, where randomly assigned coffee mugs suddenly become precious to their new owners, demonstrates how quickly we attach ourselves to things we perceive as ours. Reframing changes as trades rather than losses can reduce this kind of resistance. Instead of give up your old processes, try exchange your current process for one that saves you some time. In negotiations, making the first offer anchors possession in your favor. When someone won't budge, consider what they might fear losing beyond the obvious stakes. I'm Michael Lee, Director of the Civility Initiative and Professor of Communication at the College of Charleston. Our guest today on When We Disagree is Daniel Leman. Daniel is an Associate Professor of Philosophy and the Chair of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics major at Davidson College. He's written 2 books, Locke Among the Radicals, Liberty and Property in the 19th Century, and Is Political Authority an Illusion? A Debate. Dan, tell us an argument story.
Well, first, Mike, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. I'm excited to be here today and tell you this story. So the story I have for you is actually about the second of those 2 books that you mentioned. As the title suggests, this book is a debate. This book is grounded in and even just is a disagreement between 2 people, between me and my co-author, Michael Huemer of the University of Colorado. And I was asked to do this book sort of out of the blue. Mike Huemer is quite a big deal in political philosophy, and everyone knows his views. Everyone knows that he's an anarchist, right? Which is the view that governments of any kind, not just particular governments, this one, that one, but just governments in general are not legitimate, that they do not have a right to tell us what to do, ever. Right? It's a radical position, and he's very well known for having forcefully defended that view. So an editor at Routledge reached out, said, "Hey, you disagree with Mike Huemer, right?" I said, "I suppose I do."
Mm-hmm.
And he says, "Well, would you like to write a book debating this issue with Mike?" And of course, the answer was yes. And so one thing led to another, and then we were off to the races. So this debate was interesting in that it's about a really fundamental issue about politics, right? It's something at the very, very foundation of how we think about our political lives. It's not just, is this policy good, right? What should Social Security be like? What kind of government spending should we do? The disagreement is it okay to have governments at all, right? So I had to marshal sort of arguments that were not only as strong as I could make them, but
Mm-hmm.
sort of walked this really difficult line between, on the one hand, being highly fundamental, right, getting at the most basic issues of political morality, while also being charitable, right? Mike and I had
Mm-hmm.
to find ways to charitably read one another's arguments, even though we don't not only disagreed, forcefully, but disagreed in about the most basic way you can disagree about this topic, which
Yeah.
a bunch of interesting challenges I'll be happy to talk about.
Sure. Tell us, overview the debate as quickly as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mike starts very powerfully with a story, right? So imagine that you live in a neighborhood and you have a neighbor who correctly thinks that things have gotten pretty shoddy in the neighborhood, right? The parks are in disrepair. Maybe there's young hooligans who are littering on the street or causing property damage, whatever.
Uh-huh.
And this neighbor takes it upon his or herself to get this in hand. So she does whatever needs to be done. You know, picks up the trash. Pays for new benches that the hooligans have damaged or whatever.
These
But
hooligans.
then, but then comes to your house, says, and knocks on the door and says, "Hey, here's what I did. It really needed doing." And you say, "That's cool." But then she says,
Mm-hmm.
"And now you owe me about 22% of your income
Sure.
to help offset the costs." Um, and you say, "Well, I didn't really sign up for that.
I
That's
didn't
not cool.
consent to that.
Um, I don't really want to do that." And she says, "Well, here's the thing though, it's not optional, and you will be locked in my basement if you don't pay me."
Okay.
Now, Mike thinks plausibly that we think that's really not okay. And it doesn't become okay. No, it doesn't matter how good the purpose is that this person wants to achieve, no matter how unsightly the damage to the park, no matter how bad the potholes in the road, whatever.
Yeah.
The fact is, even if she's doing a good thing, she doesn't get to demand our money and then threaten us with being locked up if we don't give her the money. Okay.
All right.
So this is supposed to be an analog to the state. Mike says this is what the
Yeah.
government does every day. They say, here are various things we want to do. We want to, build roads, schools, whatever. Let them be as good of aims as you want them to be. And then says, and now you're going to help us pay for it. And it's not optional, and you will be imprisoned if you don't help.
Okay. What's your
That, Mike
counterclaim to
says,
this?
is what the government is like. Okay. I say, not so. Here's the difference. I say, we all have rights. Actually, Mike and I agree on this. We all have basic moral rights that people have to respect. But here's the thing, in my view, if in a world without an authority, right, who's answerable not just to some of us, but to all of us, right, whether my rights, your rights, any of our rights, actually remain safe, is just up to what other people feel like and how powerful they are, right? So if suppose we didn't have a government at all existing between us, well, you have aims, I have aims, you have rights, I have rights. What is what is either of us able to expect rationally about the security of our rights? Well, just turns on what you want and what you're able to make me do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And vice versa. And I say, but the whole point of rights is that rights cannot depend on people's arbitrary wills like that. That's why we care about having them. The point of rights is to make sure we don't depend on other people like that. So my argument is the state is not like the vigilante who knocks on your door and demands money, because the state is what makes it possible for us to relate to each other as equal rights holders in the first place. So that's the core of our disagreement.
I want to talk about the debate itself. In other words, the kind of style of debate. If I'm characterizing your positions right, this person is making a claim that essentially is really essentialist. Is that all government is based on a foundation of coercion, of people exploiting other people, of people telling other people what to do when they have no right to, of the rest of us basically enslaved without our consent by this completely irresponsive government. And that's every government. That's my current mayor all the way up to Pol Pot and everything in between. So, man, we're painting with such a ridiculously large brush here. And your claim is somewhere in the middle, right? It's not like well, no, in fact, all government is good and individuality is a complete fiction, and therefore we have to collectivize to protect all of our security. Your claim is, let's just not be ruled by capricious whims and maybe look at what's going on in stateless places. Syria comes to mind right now, where there is no responsiveness. That doesn't mean let's go back to Assad's regime, but it does mean that the rule by arbitrary decree is silly, a silly way to protect rights. So you're kind of in the middle, making, to characterize it, I hope as fairly as possible, there's kind of a situational set of judgments that you're having to make, right? You're not defending all government, whereas he's attacking all government. So this is a really long setup to, I hope, a fairly simple question, which is, what is it like to occupy this kind of situational, contextual, it depends middle when you're debating somebody at an extreme, because that person's always going to say, you're not as pure, you're being illogical, you're betraying your own belief system, and here I am, the purist out on the ledge.
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. And the answer is that it's really tough, because when you occupy that kind of position where, fine lines make a difference, right? And a lot of judgment about the details has to be made and really matters. You can be pressed with questions like, well, okay, you think government has this unique feature that can make it legitimate. Well, what about, this particular case? What about the American government, which, is not like an Assad regime, but, has been and continues to imprison people at Guantanamo without any legal recourse, right? That seems to be a fairly tyrannical kind of action. What about the history of just staggering racial injustice, right, which was perpetrated purposefully by this government and in some ways continues to exist? Why should we think that when even our favorite governments, the United States, and we can have comparable lists of activities for other democracies, have these kinds of things going on? Well, how can you say that there's this legitimacy to any degree? Isn't the pure position better? And then I found myself in the position of having to say, well, yeah, that does damage legitimacy to some degree, but not the whole degree, right? And think about how, what the trade-off would be of, trading off all of the authority and its capacity for rights enforcement in order to avoid the admittedly high-cost injustice being perpetrated by it. Those kinds of moves are in a way less satisfying than this whole thing sucks, right? This whole thing is shot. So I found that very tough, but I found myself in a position of having to make much finer grained and sometimes less immediately compelling moves than the strong absolutist position was able to make.
Yeah, let's stay here for a second. I find myself really drawn to the dilemma that you're in as a defender of a situational middle versus a radical on either side, frankly, a radical to your left or a radical to your right, because the real benefit of taking that radical position is that you look insufficiently committed to your principles. So you look like basically a charlatan, or somebody whose finger is in the air trying to figure out which way the wind blows. And the second problem is more of a rhetorical problem, which is it's virtually impossible to sloganeer. It's virtually impossible to render your position into a really compelling bumper sticker when this guy is over here saying taxation is evil, all government is slavery, is coming from a position where, you can't distinguish between a bank robber and a bank because they're both robbing you, right? They're all moral equals in this person's mind. But you can't make those kinds of really galvanizing slogans because it's quite so situational.
Yeah, I sort of thought through at one point when I was writing this, what would a slogan for my position look like? And it would be just the worst slogan ever. It would be something like, government is often, but not always legitimate, a lot of the time, but in many cases less than you would hope. Which, one, doesn't fit on the back of your car. And even if it did, who would want to read it?
I'd wear that t-shirt. I'm in. You start selling that, man. I'm in. It reminds me, there's a great essay that Margaret Atwood, who wrote The Handmaid's Tale, many other things, wrote in The Atlantic relatively recently, where she talked about this rhetorical dilemma. And she was talking about it in terms of, I believe in human freedom, but not at the expense of my ability to hurt you. I believe in free speech, but not in my propensity to galvanize immediate violence. I believe in representative democracy, but I don't think that we should vote on every bike lane every time. Right? So there are limits to our participation in democracy. And you see where I'm going with this. It's on
Absolutely.
and on and on and on. As I believe in these things, but much like going to the gym or going to therapy, it is a bit of a slog. And you have to make determinations about what's right in the moment with some guideposts, with some larger principles in mind, but you're always defending those and to some extent sacrificing them in situational moments. And so she called it the slog, right? This is the slog of the belief. And the benefit is that it is very welcoming, it's very understanding of people. And the disbenefit is that there's no such thing as a revolutionary slog.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I need to remember that because I like the way she puts it. But I think that I found myself committed to a slog. And although that led to some frustrations when the other person isn't sort of seeing their pursuit as in a slog, I really do think that the slog is where we need to conduct most of our social and political disagreements. Because the reality of sharing a social world together is one in which reasonable principles can and do and will conflict. When you try to apply them, there will be judgment that is doesn't bottom out in something else. There's just judgment that has to be done, and there'll be disagreements about how to do that judgment, and those won't neatly resolve. And at the end of the day, what you're going to get is if you've done it right, is significantly less than what you would hope for in your best case situation, which in a sense can feel less inspiring than, ushering in the revolution, whether that's destroying the state for anarcho-capitalism or, ushering in the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Right.
If you're committed to the slog, you kind of have to say, like, you know what, we're going to argue, we're going to use our judgment. It's going to be hard. We're going to screw it up. And at the end, well, you have to keep going, and you probably haven't gotten everything you wanted.
Yeah, that's right.
I think the truth about working deliberatively through a social world.
That's right. That's right. And it is a kind of, to my mind, a realistic function, a realistic goal, but it can easily be characterized as pessimistic on the one hand, and as weak-kneed on the other. Let's talk a bit about the form of the debate and the outcome of this debate. It's one thing for you to, whether you're in the pages of some literary magazine or some big public venue, or you're on TV debating about the proper role of government. And it's another to do it in the same book. Why do it in the same book?
Yeah, so one reason, which I think is a very good reason, is that the publisher Routledge wants these volumes, and there's a number of them on different philosophical topics, to present to students debates that are conducted at a high rigorous level in a single volume, so students can sort of interact with this as a sort of high quality argument unfolding in front of them.
Right.
And I think that's a very good pedagogical tool. So that's one reason why the press and so many other presses put out these books. But the way it actually unfolds is chapter by chapter. So Mike wrote the first chapter arguing for the truth of his view. Then I replied. Then he wrote a shorter than the first chapter reply to me, and I wrote my second shorter chapter, and then we each got closing statements. So it was a kind of discursive back and forth, which actually I think works quite well.
Yeah, I agree with that. And as somebody who's very much pro debate, I'm very interested in books or shows or whatever that really showcases real debate. I mean, I often ask people if your book was a television episode, if Netflix commissioned a show that had a reasonable moderator, who's essentially just a decent debate coach trying to make everybody's argument better and hear all sides, not trying to promote a point of view, just a pro debate agenda. And Netflix has this, and then they get experts like you to come on. And here's the proposition. Is government evil or something along those lines? And then you say no, and he says yes, and we go from there. It's a 30-minute episode. You get 15-ish minutes. That person, Mike, your co-author, gets 15-ish minutes, and we call it a day. The question for me is, would you watch that show? And I think a decent number of people would watch it, provided it doesn't descend. This is where my question is going, provided it doesn't descend into the stereotype of debates as either acrimonious, angry fisticuffs on the one hand, or just people not answering the question and not dealing with the topic and having side by side, completely unresponsive press conferences, but sharing the same stage. So my question is, you obviously had a position, you were chosen or self-selected to write on behalf of a position you already believed. He was already relatively influential in this philosophical circle for being an anarchist or pushing anarchist ideas. Did you come in and rehearse the arguments you had already believed? Was there anything in the debate that made you kind of change your mind or come to his side or him to come to your side or see the world differently? Or is the book a vehicle for you to kind of concretize, to formalize the things you've already said, the things you already believe?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would just say I would absolutely watch that show. Someone makes that show a reality.
All right.
But
you and me both.
Yeah, so I'd say I definitely did develop and in some ways change my view in the course of writing this book. So in going into it, I had a general sense of why I took it to be possible for government to be legitimate. But I never actually published directly on that issue. I published on issues sort of surrounding it or tangential to it, but never directly on it. So I'd never been asked to actually sit down and work out really rigorously why exactly I think this is true and why exactly I think the kind of vigilante challenge is not successful. And the act of doing this debate actually gave me the opportunity to build out my sort of decently put together but somewhat inchoate reasoning into sharp, clear, I hope, convincing argument. And I should say too, to your second part of your question, one point which we really interestingly did agree, and I had actually not thought about until Mike pressed me to think about it, was jury nullification.
Right.
So jury nullification is what happens when a jury of a jury of peers in a trial, typically but not necessarily a criminal trial, decide that they're not going to find someone guilty of a crime for which the prosecution has, in an ordinary sense, presented sufficient evidence on the grounds that those jury members take the case or the law or both to be egregious and unjustified. Mike argued that this power of jury nullification is a very important kind of moral check on the power of the state, which of course he'd prefer not to exist at all, but he thinks that it's a kind of little breaking in, little sort of crack of anarchism right in the edifice of the state. And I actually took his point. I decided, and I didn't put it quite the same way, but I wanted to say, you know what, this is insofar as you build this power of juries into a role, that's a kind of sort of direct, hardcore accountability of the state to the people that can help drag the state back into its rights protecting role under the most egregiously violating circumstances. So we've found ourselves actually agreeing that jury nullification is pretty great and we need to maintain it.
Well, and there you are, frankly, back to the slog, because he can defend any kind of secession or separation from federal, state, or local law as a legitimate revolution, either capital R revolution or lowercase r revolution. But you are back to defending the rule of law is largely good, except when Rosa Parks violates bus ordinances, or except when King writes letter from a Birmingham jail.
Exactly. And I have to try and tell a story, which is a difficult story that I'm sure I didn't tell all the way correctly, about how it's possible and sometimes necessary to defend the rule of law as a fundamental kind of both social apparatus and political value by way of sometimes violating laws, which is, I think, the correct logic of various forms of civil disobedience and conscientious refusal. But as you say, it's really hard, right? How do you draw lines? Both where are the lines and what's the proper method for drawing them? And those kinds of questions do become a slog. There's cases upon cases, there's reasoning by analogy, there's judgment calls that are just going to have to be made and defended in piecemeal fashion. And yeah, that issue brings us right back to the slog.
Daniel Lehrman, Enjoy the slog, and thanks so much for being on When We Disagree.
Thanks, Mike. It's been a pleasure to be on.
When We Disagree is recorded at the College of Charleston with creator and host Michael Lee. Recording and sound engineering by Jesse Kunz and Lance Laidlaw. Reach out to us at whenwedisagree@gmail.com.